Gardeners. How may I help you?
Hello and welcome to Calling All Gardeners here on Shaw. And you're watching this program live, May 19th. It is 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. live. And you might be wondering, why is it called Calling All Gardeners? It's because you can call in and get expert gardening advice live on Shaw here. So we'll give you the number and the how to call in just a moment. But first, I'm going to introduce our expert panel of gardeners. Today we have John Morgan in studio. Now, John actually has an honors degree in zoology, ecology, master's degree in natural resource management from the University of Manitoba. So very, very smart gardener. Born in Ontario, he's lived and worked across the prairie and the Arctic. And he's worked as a research biologist in Canada's high Arctic in the 70s, a wildlife habitat biologist on the prairies in the 80s, and John initiated the Tall Grass Prairie Inventory in 1986, which led to Manitoba's Tall Grass Prairie Preserve near Vida. Thanks so much for coming, John.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And we also have a returning guest on today's program, Carla Hersina. Now, Carla is at St. Mary's, and she has a natural flair for gardening in all aspects, including landscape, perennials, annuals, and container planting. Carla is passionate about helping make environments green, and Carla has been featured on programs such as CTV's Get Growing and Green Thumbs on City TV. But of course, she was featured a couple weeks ago on this program on Shaw. Thanks so much for coming again, Carla.
You're very welcome.
All right, so we'll get to your callers in a moment, and we'll also have some presentations by our experts here. But first, we actually had a couple people call in and a question from last week's program we're going to revisit. Now, this program, last week, Carol, she was wondering how to keep deer out of her garden, a big problem here in Manitoba. And she asked you to send us a few of your suggestions. Now, here are some of the suggestions people called in. Pat and another caller suggested using human hair as a deterrent. Do you think that would work? Getting a haircut in your yard?
You know what? Sometimes you get some people will maybe think that it works, and some will just say it's maybe a wise tale. How it goes in. It's hard to know.
Yeah. Deer are, individuals. Some of them will prefer things, and some of them won't. I think one of the best things for deer is to plant plants that they don't like to eat. So if you can find that, there are many of the grasses they won't touch, in my experience. And also there's a really good reference I saw at Lee Valley Tools a wee while ago called How to Deer-Proof Your Landscape. So that was a great book with good suggestions about plants that deer generally don't like.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, because another caller suggested another strange thing, which was human urine. I don't know if that's good for your garden or not, but are deers, is it like a territorial thing? Do you think that would work? Would the neighbors be upset?
Maybe. I think the phone calls might start coming in.
Controversial.
Yeah. But there's, let's see, another suggestion, actually installing an outer fence around 3 feet away from your existing fence, or create a moat so the deer are afraid of being caught in the middle.
Yes, I watch too, because even in some areas we've seen, and we've had people report in that some deer can actually go as high as 8 feet tall. So, they can jump.
Okay, so, really high fence or...
maybe try planting some plants that they don't like, either by experience or using some reference books or that type of thing.
Sounds good. Now, John, let's go to your presentation. Now, you wanted to talk here about landscaping with native prairie.
Right. Yeah, I'd probably give you a bit of an introduction into using native plants in the home landscape. and what people can plant, one of the maybe few of the reasons why they might like to use native species, and we could give you some examples. I've got a couple of good books with me. I might start with those if you like.
Sure, go ahead.
One of the best ones is this one. It's called Naturescape Manitoba, And Naturescape Manitoba is written by a group of folks here from Winnipeg and the region, and it's just a fantastic guide on how to use native species in your own yard. And so right from A to Z, basically, you can get all kinds of ideas, design, what species to use, how they look, what are their blooming times, and that type of thing. So this is a great local reference for that. Another one that's an American book but has a lot of relevance here is this one called Gardening with Prairie Plants, and it's a great book for design ideas as well as a few different species that you can use too. And another topic that we often get interest in is how to landscape for butterflies. Butterflies are always a perennial favorite, and most native plants have a host of butterflies that depend on them for food and for rearing their young ones. So if you know a little bit about the butterflies and the plants that attract them, even if you live in downtown Winnipeg, you can have butterflies in your backyard. So it's one of the great things that you can do. So maybe if we could have the first slide, please, that would be great. And what we usually do, and we tend to take an approach to landscaping, which is maybe a little different than most people. We use this kind of landscape as our guidebook or our inspiration. Manitoba's native tallgrass prairie here in this region in the Red River Valley used to cover the area from horizon to horizon. And if we could have the next slide. One of the things I always stress with using native species is that it's very important part of a conservation effort. We have less than 1% of our original native prairie left here in Manitoba, the tallgrass prairie in particular. So even a small patch of your yard or your boulevard or a schoolyard or a city park can make a huge difference to the conservation of these species. There are some plants now that are so endangered in the wild that are growing. There's more of them in gardens here in Winnipeg than there is in the wild left in Manitoba because people are starting to use native plants. The next one. So this is the kind of landscape that, although I don't think that anybody in our business could be as creative as this, this is the inspiration that we take from. This is a bison rubbing stone in a native prairie in the interlake with lichens and dotted blazing star, prairie sage, wild rose. So this is the kind of approach that we take. So if I could have the next one, please. A lot of people think of native plants as wildflowers, and that's true. We'll show a few of those in a minute, but also important are the native grasses. This is little bluestem, and I call it the queen of the prairie. Little bluestem is a beautiful landscaping grass, and when we show these to landscape architects, they just go, wow, is this native? And I said, yeah, and it grows in some of the toughest and most difficult parts of the prairie. And the next picture will show you this is big bluestem, and big bluestem is one of the main grasses of the tallgrass prairie. It's Manitoba's provincial grass with a beautiful bur oak and kind of a savanna at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve southeast of Winnipeg. So just to give you an example of what sometimes the grasses can show for you. Next one, please. And here is the little bluestem in the wintertime. So you can see even in the winter you can get some beautiful colors. Little bluestem is kind of a pinky red in the summer, and it holds that color well into the winter. So next one, please. Our provincial flower, prairie crocus, which is blooming now and has been blooming for a few weeks, will bloom sometimes as early as late March or well into April and sometimes into May, and will bloom through the snow. And these are incredibly tough and hardy. If you have a sunny, dry place in your yard, that's the best place for these. They love it sunny, hot, and dry. And they're a fantastic addition to any landscape, and really the first flower that you're going to see after winter.
Very sunny, hot, and dry this
year.
Yeah,
sunny, hot, and dry. They love it. They're really doing well. Next one, please. A lot of interest is being shown by people in how to attract pollinating insects to their gardens, and there's a whole wide variety of bees and butterflies and other little insects that are attracted to native plants. Most native species have high levels of nectar, and many insects have evolved for thousands of years to be dependent on them and to come in and feed on them. And if you know that and take advantage of that, you can have these bees and butterflies in your own yard, even in the middle of the city. And they add a tremendous amount to it, and they do a real service too. They pollinate the plants, both native and non-native plants. Next one, please. The monarch butterfly is very popular, and it feeds on milkweeds. So monarchs are something that, if we have the next one, I can show you what they look like. The little caterpillar that is hatched out in the next slide. That one, that's what their caterpillars look like, and they feed on members of the milkweed family, which we can see in the next slide are some of the most beautiful wildflowers.
Should people be concerned that their flowers are going to get eaten too much?
No, not with the monarchs. They will only eat milkweeds. That's it, and they won't feed on anything else. So if you have milkweeds, you'll have monarchs. It's that simple.
It's a beautiful flower.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
It's beautiful. And
Yeah, it is just splendid, and it smells like lilacs.
Yeah, and the different varieties that you have too. There's different colors.
There's 5 or 6 different species of milkweeds.
Yeah.
So is this your backyard?
Yeah,
here?
typical sort of backyard, a little different than most people's backyard, but this is something that you can do with native species and have your backyard a real haven for butterflies and wildlife. And the next one, I think we've got a few others as well. This is a before and after. This picture shows a small inner city garden, about 6 feet by 6 feet. And this is planting around now, around the May long weekend. And the next picture will show what it looked like the next year. These are all perennials. These all come up every year. And this is now been moved along the street. Other yards have adopted this and made
Was that
up.
overnight?
No, that was the next. It takes about a year for native plants to develop because they're perennials. They're slow, basically slow growing.
I see.
So you have to be a little patient. But now they're there forever. That was planted almost 30 years ago and is still there on Garfield Street. This is at the Forks, which is a good example of one of the first commercial plantings ever done with native species in Canada. Downtown at the Forks down in about 1988-89. And this now has expanded tremendously over the Forks area and has added an incredible historical background to the history and the culture and natural history of the Forks area, because these plants used to grow there. And this is out in this part of the city in St. Vital area, and shows a front yard right out to the street with native wildflowers like bergamot and Culver's root and some of the native sunflowers mixed in with many different native grasses. And next one. So just an example of some of, well, we have 700 and some native species in Manitoba, and this is a couple here, yellow coneflower, fleabane, and in the bottom right there's one called upland white goldenrod. So if you're interested in kind of Manitoba's history, wildlife, bringing a little bit of nature into your yard, then it doesn't matter where you live. Even apartment balconies with really deep containers, you can have native wildflowers and grasses in their beauty.
And you brought a couple here that we have on the bench.
Yeah, this is some that are out in bloom right now, northern bog violet, and this is western Canada wood violet. So these are some of the early spring, sort of very shade tolerant. We often get people asking us, what can we grow in shade around houses or under trees? And the violets in the wild tend to grow in those places. So you can use that to your benefit in your yard if you have a shady spot that's a bit moist.
Well, thanks so much for that presentation and showing you how you can maintain some of Manitoba's history while gardening. Now, if you have a gardening question for our experts, you can give us a call for, I believe it's 480-3500, and we're going to have a little information on how to call in. Right now, you're watching Calling All Gardeners on Shaw.
Do you have a gardening question for one of our experts on the show today? We would love to hear from you. Please phone in to register your question by dialing 204-480-3500. Leave a message and volunteers will call you back as soon as they can. That's when we put your question out live on air. You can also register your question online. Go to shaw.ca/ShawTV Winnipeg or check our Facebook page. Shaw TV is grateful for the support of our community sponsors.
Welcome back to Calling All Gardeners here on Shaw TV in Winnipeg. Now, it's time for you to weigh in with your gardening questions. We have a caller on the line. Our first caller tonight is Rebecca. Now, Rebecca, do you have a question for our gardening experts about gardening?
I sure do.
Yes! Go ahead.
I'm not much of a gardener. I've never really been successful at keeping plants alive, but I'd really like to have a nice looking garden, and our backyard, we haven't, it's just overgrown since we moved in 2008. So I was wondering if maybe you had any suggestions on how to tame the overgrown, I think they're cedar bushes, but I don't know, and any good starter plants that we could add to that area. It gets full sunlight all day, and no shade.
Okay.
Well, with the cedars and that kind of stuff that have gone really wild, generally the cedars, you wait until the new growth opens up and then you can do your pruning. I classically call it Father's Day gift, because usually about mid-June the new buds have formed and you're able to take a little bit of a light shearing off that. Unfortunately, if you go too heavy on shearing your cedars, you're going to be going to those areas that are kind of balding out on each other. So you have to be really careful on how much you want to eliminate or shear back. Sometimes too, if they get too overgrown, it may be an option that you may want to start over. Or at some points too, some people will lift it, the lower canopies or lower portions of your cedars and do some underplantings.
Okay, yeah, because I think what we were thinking is removing those cedars altogether. They've just gone so crazy. I don't know if we can prune them down again.
Yeah, you know what, sometimes, and some plants have their longevity that's going through it, and you'll find that once you start over, some plants do get tired. So it's commonly done where you just do a clean up and remove and you start fresh.
Okay.
And if you're looking for some native plants that are easy to grow, things like black-eyed Susan, Gaillardia, the violets here that we have, especially if you still maintain some cedars, they grow well in a bit of shady spots under them. That's where they often grow in the wild. So those are some examples of a few easy-to-grow native species that you could add in if you like.
Thanks so much for the call, Rebecca. You know what they say, cedar ya later. That's what Rebecca said. Now we actually have an email from Shirley, an email question. Okay. She has a screened-in balcony with screened openings on the side. What kind of plants should she put there? Now, I know there's a lot of plants to choose from, but screened openings, screened-in balcony.
You're going to be doing it with the screened-in balcony. You're going to be doing container plantings for sure. And it depends on if you can be in a screened-in garden, but it also depends on what exposure you have. If I'm in a screened and I'm still facing south, you're still going to want to choose plants that favor a little bit more brighter light conditions. So we really want to know where your direction of your sun is in order to steer you to the right plant.
Okay. Do you have any added to this?
Yeah, you can do container gardening on balconies with native plants, but again, you mentioned about having to know how much sun you get. Mm-hmm. It's critical you get lots of sun, so whether it's a south exposure or north makes a big difference. Some of the best wildflowers and native species that we've seen for containers are some of the shallower rooted ones, so things like hairy golden aster and even the black-eyed Susans and Gaillardia are not too bad, as long as your containers are at least about a foot deep or 30 centimeters deep.
So we have another caller, a live caller here. His name is Frank. Now, Frank, do you have a gardening question here that we can help you with?
Yes, I have two, if I may.
Go ahead, Frank.
One thing I have, as I was told, is an orchid cactus, and it hasn't bloomed for me for 2 years. I have it hanging from the ceiling, and the bracts are down to about 3 feet from the floor. Now my question is, can I cut it back, and would it harm the plant?
I don't think it's going to harm the plant, because if it hasn't bloomed in probably 2 years' time, it's probably time to do a little bit of maintenance on it, whether it needs to be repotted or if you're doing a little bit of light pruning on it. And sometimes going through these stages, it will actually act as a resurgence and maybe cause a blooming effect for that plant to set a blooming period.
Oh, so it won't hurt it if I, severely prune it.
I don't know if I would severely prune it. I usually take it in consideration when we're doing a lot of our pruning. We usually take up to 1/3 of it off.
Okay.
Okay.
Another question I have about garlic. Do I plant it in the spring or do I plant it in the fall? And how deep do I plant it?
You can actually plant it in both of it. Sometimes there's spring garlic and sometimes there's fall garlic. And when you're planting it, you're going to be breaking up the cloves that's on it. And there is a correct way to plant it up, or you want to have the pip of it facing upwards. If you're not too sure, plant it on its side and it will naturally correct itself. And it should be planted just under the surface of the soil.
All right, thanks so much for that call, Frank. And garlic, obviously a very, very popular these days. It's a hip food to eat.
That keeps the vampires away.
Exactly, yeah. All those vampires these days, yeah. Now, why don't we go to an email question, because we have so many. We have one from Maureen. How do I get started on indoor gardening? So I guess, what are the first steps you would make to having plants indoors successfully? Because I know a lot of people fail at that. At least people I know.
Well, I think looking at indoor gardening, it's whether you want to go indoor gardening as in tropicals, or are you wanting to start your plants inside so that they eventually go outdoors. So there's the clarity. But indoor gardening, I think, is start off small. Don't go out and invest in a ton of tropicals if it's the tropical direction that you want to go into, because at that point you'll be able to sort of start in slowly, as if you can care for it and learn the process of how to grow a plant. If it's growing seedlings indoors, then you're going to have to sort of maybe investigate or come into one of the garden centers and learn the process. Start going through, what do I need? Start off with maybe the easy seeds and ask which are the quickest seeds that I can grow successfully. We don't want to set you up with something that's going to have a long germination period that's on it. We will give you something that has a shortened germination period, so you see something reactionary quick, so that you're able to have reward with that.
What would you say, John?
Yeah, when you're beginning, for sure. I mean, I don't know too much about indoor gardening, but just from a little bit of experience, it's great to have stuff that you have success with. So if you know somebody that has plants that you like, ask them questions, maybe get some advice or some plants from them. Talk to garden centers, because they often have wide-ranging experiences of what type of plants do well in this type of a setting. And it can be challenging to have plants indoors, especially in the wintertime. We don't get a lot of light, so that's often one of the things that they want something bright and flowering all winter, but it's not always possible in this climate, even inside.
It's knowing the exposure too. It's like that screened house.
Yeah.
You need to know how much light do you have, where your exposure is. Like if your kitchen is very recessed and you don't have any windows, natural windows on it, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. But then there's some plants that are on the market, like we call it mother-in-law's tongue, or sansevierias, or snake plants. These plants can go into low light levels. So at that point, there are some choices for low light. But if you have a bright, sunny location, there's definitely a full spectrum of plants that you will have success for. And I think the one thing that we always kind of say is we're sometimes overly too kind to our plants, where we water them too much. And the old saying is you can save a plant if it's underwatered, but you can't save a plant when it's overwatered.
Right, or if you put it on the radiator.
Oh yeah, don't cook it either, don't cook it.
So we have a caller. Let's go to Jim. Now, Jim, are you on the line? And thanks for coming.
Yes, I'm here.
All right, perfect. So what is your question for our expert gardeners here?
Where can I find horsetail in Manitoba, or in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, close to Winnipeg? And if they know the answer, the best way to extract the silica from it.
Yep, horsetail is a really interesting plant. Whenever I look at it, I just imagine the history. It's one of the oldest plants in the world, It was around when the dinosaurs were here, long before there was even flowering plants, even before flowering plants and grasses and trees evolved. Horsetails are one of the first land plants. And if you look at them, if you look at a book on dinosaurs, if it's accurate, or if you go to a dinosaur museum, they'll have giant horsetails there, and that's what they were. And the same, very similar species, I think it's the same genus, still grows here in Manitoba today. There's a couple of different species, but they all have that narrow little stalk that's segmented, and it has almost like a cone on the top. It's not really a cone, but it's a beautiful little plant, very tough and hardy. It can grow in water up to 3 or 4 feet deep, or it can grow almost on completely dry land and almost everything in between. It's incredibly adaptable. And Native people called it scouring rush, and it was used to clean pots and things. And it's got a lot of silica in it, and it's really quite abrasive, so it's good for shining aluminum or other things like that. And if you have the best place to find it, I've seen around the edge of the city where there's ditches, say along the highway or along some gravel section roads just outside of the city. And any area right now that's got a bit of water in it, you're almost guaranteed to find horsetails.
Okay, so you can find them.
I've never seen them for sale. I don't know of anybody that sells them, but
We used to
Oh,
we used to
okay,
have it in the
cool.
water plant section.
Oh, yeah, okay,
So in the
cool.
water plant section, you're sometimes able to get it, and they've been a little bit more rare lately on that side.
okay.
Because I know that they are fast spreading.
yes, they
They're
will
very
spread.
they're very fast spreading.
They're
So
competitive.
yeah. So if you have small gardens and that kind of stuff, you have to be careful. It's almost like know thy roots of plants
Yeah,
when you are planting them in your
I
garden.
would keep them in a container.
Yep.
Kind of if you put them in a water garden or something, keep them confined a little bit, because if they like it, they'll spread like crazy.
Yep. Yep.
That's super interesting. Horsetail is the steel wool of
Yeah,
the plant
exactly.
kingdom.
Yeah, that's how they work. Yeah, it's really neat.
Well, thanks for that call, Jim. We have another caller, Maria. You're on Calling All Gardeners here on Shaw TV. Do you have a question
Hi.
for us?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Last year I planted asparagus, and it's all come up beautiful, but I don't know if I'm supposed to be using a fertilizer of any kind.
Because it's a vegetable, you would probably want to do something organic. There's just compost would work well for you, or even at that sometimes too in the early stages there is some fish fertilizers that are good nutrient based. But I would probably stay away from some of the granular chemical type fertilizers and go more organic.
Okay, I've got compost, so I'll just use that then. Thank you very kindly.
And yeah,
Bye-bye.
put some garlic with that asparagus and got everything you need. Now, if you're wondering how to call in on the show, maybe you've just joined us and you're wondering, you can take a look at this quick video. Calling All Gardeners on Shaw TV.
Do you have a gardening question for one of our experts on the show today? We would love to hear from you. Please phone in to register your question by dialing 204-480-3500. Leave a message and volunteers will call you back as soon as they can. That's when we put your question out live on air. You can also register your question online. Go to shaw.ca/Shaw TV Winnipeg or check our Facebook page. Shaw TV is grateful for the support of our community sponsors.
But that's the
All right, we are back here on Calling All Gardeners on Shaw, and Carla Hersina is actually going to give us a presentation here. Now, she's going to show you how to put together containers with flair.
Yes, and you know, my container gardening right now, we're right at the peak of gardening right now. So what we have, and what I thought I'd bring for you is a selection plants that are favorable either for garden, but a lot of people are seeing that they want to do container gardenings. And when we talked about container gardening with flair, do we talk plants or we talk pottery? Because the flair can be both ways. And I wanted to show you a little bit of that. You saw earlier the little face with the chives that were in it, that was on the set. That's a container that could be used, and we're growing herbs in it. It could be also with grasses that's in it, so it's a little bit of fun. And then if you take on some of the shots, when you're looking at container gardens, containers can be, you know, a trug base, or it could be the fun little shoes that's on the bottom. So there's a lot of flair in creating containers with flowers, but what you really want to do is start with the foundation of a beautiful container. And your container may depict on how you want to present your flowers, okay? Containers too, you have to know, again, exposure. Where are we going to put these containers? Black containers will warm up faster than lighter color containers. And then looking at it too is, I know in this foot one, there's a great big hole in the bottom for drainage. So now there's so many different aspects that we want to tell you about container gardening, that drainage would be key in the success, unless we want to grow horsetail. Okay? If we want to put horsetail in, there's no plug. We're going to fill it up and we're going to end up with a little soupy mess that's in there. But the horsetail will just love that. We just love it. So look at the containers, and it's not all the shiny pots, but it's sometimes the flowers that you put in them that sort of add character. You know, this is the kind of aged, but it has that patina and that soft, sort of romantic, woodsy look that's to it. Once you've selected your container though, oh my gosh, everyone's going through the garden centers right now, and I know even myself, I go into the garden center and I think this is my game plan for that year. And you go in there and it's like there's a whole selection that you can choose from. So I thought I would bring you a few, and we just grabbed a color, but you see how beautiful this was, even in combination. So it's looking again on exposure of your containers or your flowers. Is it going to be full sun, or is it going to be shade? So you may be steered to some of these, and I'm going to tell you some of these because I think some people may be interested in them. There's a phlox, a beautiful color of phlox that's in here. This will go sun to part shade. So when I'm thinking of my container, you have to companion plant two. See, already there's so much information, right? And we're just thinking container gardening.
Take notes, people. Yep.
Take notes. There's lots. We can help you if you don't get it all. Oxalis. And this is a cute little one too. And a lot of people, we see flowers here, but the reason why I brought you some non-flowering plants is to show you that there's color and diversity and texture that's happening in foliage plants too. And just to
You
mimic.
don't just have to have a flower.
You don't have, and we see that with blades of grass too. In the environment where we're doing landscaping, you can have characteristics with blades of grass and foliage. Like on this one here, look at the beautiful red stemming in here. So you see the beautiful red stemming, which is going to contrast the color of the chartreuse green color here. And with the pop of the phlox, it gives it that pop of color. Now begonias, when you go into some of your begonias, again, the foliage that contrasts to it, there's structure that's happening. Some new ones in the block, or is this celosia. This one's called Celosia Deep Purple, and it has the resilience of being a very vertical lift that's on it. And I think when you're looking at grasses and structures of doing your containers, you want something that gives you height in a container, whether it's in the center of the container or placed at the back. We brought something that was reminiscent of some of the grasses.
Yeah,
we said
the papyrus.
That's
gorgeous.
And that's this grass that's down here. And you will find that we were talking about grasses and horsetail going into water sites. The papyrus is paired to go also water side, in the water, at pond side, or plant it in a container.
Yeah.
So we have this one, which is King Tut, which will go 3 to 4 feet tall, sometimes taller. And then we have Baby Tut, which would be for maybe that more delicate little container that's going to be shorter. Okay?
So there's so many options of, I guess, containers, plants, mix and match, and how you want to do it. You said some were the new ones on the block. Is that just because they're new plants, or are they just more popular now?
Well, they're relatively new. The Celosia intense has been around for a couple years, but it's still relatively new. So if some people haven't really investigated and gone into growing that, this is the year that maybe they said, I saw a friend that grew this, and what is it? You know, or they'll have a picture. It's almost like they start to describe this, and you know that somebody else has had it, and you can nail it and say, I know exactly which plant you're looking for. But it's looking at it and it's investigating. Probably this is the opportune time, being May long weekend, is going into there and looking at the color palettes that are out and making that combination. And I think the number one, probably the number one question is, what is the right way, or what are the right colors that I put together?
Right.
And basically, there's no right when you're dealing with colors. I strongly say if you create a color theme that you like and you love it, then you've done the right thing. So you fall out of love of certain colors sometimes. You know, you may be blue and pink one year, and you might with a little yellow, and the very next year you want to go Tropicana because you want to have a pool party, and you've gone to oranges and reds and yellows. So it's full spectrum of color. You just got to make it and love it.
Yeah, I think this is the year for the pool party, personally. Now, I just want to give you an important note also that many of the shows on Shaw TV, they're created by volunteers, just like this show. And if you'd like to volunteer or participate in any local television production, you can email createtv@shaw.ca. Now, I think it's time that we take some calls here on Calling All Gardeners. Let's start with Leroy. Leroy, do you have a question for our gardeners? I'm guessing you do.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay, I got two questions.
Two.
One, I got what kind of a flowering plant is good for shade? And what do you think of sheep manure around rose beds?
Okay, we'll start with the first question. Flowers for shade?
Flowers for shade, you're going to be looking at, you can go into some of the begonias. Definitely there are some begonias that you will go into shade, but just watch too, because when you go into the garden centers also too, there are some new begonias that actually favor more sunny locations. So now we're getting a little bit of a switch. Okay, so just watch your labels. And the other one that I would probably say is impatiens will go into shade. And when you say shade, we would also want to know how much shade. Because when we're talking about looking at growing conditions from full sun to part shade or diffuse shade, some of those plants that like full sun actually do a little bit better when they have a little bit of shade too as well. It's like us, we love the full sun, but we perform better when we have a little bit of shade on us because we stay, our colors don't fade as long and that. But if it's deep, deep shade, impatiens, begonias, you can even go into some of the foliage plants like ipomaeas. So play on some of the foliage plants and paired with some flowers.
And some of the native plants that like shade, we brought a couple today, the violets, any of the violets, they'll do well in shade as long as they get a little bit of sun during the day. And things like ostrich ferns, those are gorgeous, especially in really shaded areas. They don't have a flower, but their foliage is incredible. And they're also edible when they come out of the ground. Right now, they're just emerging, and they come out as these little fiddleheads. So you can fry them up with mushrooms and onions, and they're fantastic. So a few other ones that are good in shade, Canada goldenrod, if you want a taller one with a bright yellow flower, will tolerate quite a bit of shade as well. And another one, if you want a really tall one, is called tall coneflower, and it'll grow 8-10 feet tall in very shaded areas. You find along riverbanks and sort of wet riverbanks. So that's a couple of the native examples of shade-tolerant plants.
There's another one too that I should say, because when we're talking about the begonias and the impatiens, they can both go to baskets and containers, because now we always talk about floor containers, but there's always hanging baskets too. And there's one that I really like, it's called Torinia. And Torinia is a cascading, so it basically is going to tumble over the side of the pot. And you can get them in shades of a sort of this amethyst burgundy color right to a purple color. And they have a trumpeted shaped flower that's on it, so they're also favorable to hummingbirds. So there's a little bit of a twist too.
Yeah.
So even with the impatiens, you may get some hummingbirds, but put say some Torinia in there and maybe some English ivy for your hanging baskets, and you have a combination.
That's a few options for you there, Leroy. Now, you had a second part to that question? Or the second question? Could you repeat that again?
Using sheep manure
sheep
around
manure.
rose
Sheep manure around
roses.
rose beds? Is
Sure,
that
sure. That's a good it's a good organic feed. Your roses are heavy producers. You'll notice that when you have your first flush of roses on your flowers, that you want to keep up with the feed that's on them, because what's going to happen is sometimes you see that the leaves start to yellow mid-season. So if you keep up with your fertilizer, and this is a good organic feed for it, it'll help with the nitrogen to keep the leaves nice and healthy, and you could get a secondary bloom. Deadheading will also help you to get a secondary bloom on your roses.
All right, thanks so much, Leroy. Now we do have an email question. Something you might wonder whether to be concerned about. She's asking, is the toxic wild parsnip plant in Ontario a concern for Manitoba?
Yes.
Yes,
yeah,
it is.
It's here, unfortunately, yes. And it's pretty tall, usually grows in sort of shaded, wet areas, but it's very invasive, it's very aggressive, and will spread. And it produces kind of a toxic sap if you walk through it. Some people, even if you just touch it, it's somewhat like poison ivy. It'll create that really bad rash on certain people. And especially if you break the plant and you get some of the sap on your skin, it's almost like an acid. It's really a bad plant. So it's pretty tall usually and has yellow flowers on the top of a tall stalk. It's in the hemlock or parsnip family. So if you see something that's tall and yellow, looking kind of like a parsnip in the woods or in a wet area, stay away from it. It's probably this one.
I see. So yeah, careful of your parsnips. Is this new, like in Manitoba?
I don't know that it's new. It's been around for a while, but it seems to be increasing. I'm not sure why, but yeah, I've seen more and more of it, and it can be a real concern.
Okay, so watch out for the toxic wild parsnip plants. Now we do have another live caller. Thanks so much for calling, Olga. And you're on the air here on Calling All Gardeners.
Yeah, I'm speaking. I'm there. Thank you. You take my phone call.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And my question is about lilies. I got the lilies bulbs several days ago, and I know how to plant it, but I'm not sure it is how will be result of after I plant it, because the bulbs already have stems, and stems quite long, almost maybe 5 inch. It will be okay if I will plant it already with these long stems.
It'll be okay to plant it. What you want to do is if we're looking at the picture right now where you have your bulb to where your leaf set is, try planting it where you see that break point, where you see the brown bulbing to the green. You don't, that's on it. So generally plant it higher just so that you keep it from rotting, okay? Next year you'll probably find that it's going to set a little bit deeper. Lily bulbs have a tendency to go deeper and deeper when you're planting anyway. So keep it a little bit higher so that you just don't rot it.
Does that help?
Yeah, I understood. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for the call, Olga. Plant those lily bulbs high. Now, we got an email question. It's tips. People are wondering about tips for growing ornamental grasses. Now, so I guess they're wondering whether shade, sun, how much water, how to prepare the soil, all those things. So ornamental grasses, are those like the fancy diamond grasses, or I don't know.
Got one here.
Yeah, we've got one here. This is the papyrus that's in through here. But you're thinking about ornamental grasses, and ornamental grasses, the ones that are really favorable right now is the Karl Forster, which is basically, it's beautiful. It's Calamagrostis Karl Forster, so you have this foliage that goes 24 to 28 inches, and in the fall you have these beautiful looking wheat sheaths that's on it. So this is a full sun grass, whereas there's also grasses, flame grass, Miscanthus flame grass.
It's more shade tolerant.
It could take part shade or part sun that's in there. Varieties that go into deep shade.
Not too many. There are some woodland grasses that naturally grow in amongst the trees. Things like Canada wild rye and hairy wild rye. Those are a couple of native grasses. They'll grow anywhere. Clay to sand to silt to gravel, shade to sun. But in the wild rye has a beautiful barley-like seed head with long kind of threads on the head. It's very graceful, and it holds the seed head all winter. If you have a sunny area, one of my favorites is big blue stem. That's our provincial grass. It's tall and it's red. Whoever named it was colorblind because it's actually not red, not blue. It's red. It's more of a purpley red. Has a little bit of blue right at the base, but nobody ever sees that. But it's gorgeous. It can grow anywhere from 3 to 6 to 7 feet tall.
It's
depending.
gorgeous.
Oh, and it is one of the most splendid ornamental grasses, and it's native. It's tough and hardy. You can grow it in containers as long as your container's at least about a foot and a half deep, and you cover it with snow in the wintertime so it doesn't dry out. It'll do fine, but it makes a really lovely sort of tall border with shorter stuff in front of it. A nice, really short grass. We showed some pictures earlier of little blue stem. I call it sort of the queen of the prairie. It's a beautiful silvery pinky red in summer and fall, and then it holds a lot of that color throughout the winter. So there's many different species, but those are some examples of some nice ornamental natives.
Okay.
I think the other part of that question is how to prepare it.
Right.
Yep.
And generally, if you're preparing it in a bed or even in an area that's an existing lawn, we're very clay-based and we're very compact on our soils. So whenever you're planting, dig a hole twice as wide and try and either remove that clay base of a garden if you haven't done the natural prepping on it, and backfill it with a nice loose composty soil. And the most important one is in the first year you have to maintain it by watering it and making sure that there's viability on that root systems for it to survive. And then once that root system of those grasses get into the existing ground, because it will emerge through that nice tilth of new soil, and that the fine roots will eventually anchor into that pre-existing clay that's outside. So what you want to do is water. Let it dry out, then water it again.
Right.
In the first year, establishing it by getting it established in that soil is probably the most important thing.
There we go. I think we answered that very well. And we have another live caller. Graham is on the line here on Calling All Gardeners. Thanks so much for calling in, Graham.
Oh, thanks for having me call in. I really like the show.
All right. I'm glad you're watching and not gardening right now, this second, May 19th, 6:30 to 7:30 p.m., where this airs live. Now, Graham, what's the question you have for our experts here?
I have a north windy faced patio in Sage Creek, and I was wondering what the best plants would be for it.
Well, if you have it really windy, it's probably really windy and really hot. So you want to get plants that have very good stemming and have this rigidity that's to them. I would stay away from a lot of cascading plants and look at ones that are really kind of strong and firm. And you'll see that too. Like there's this one here. I don't know if you see this one. Upright stemming of it. You'll see how the stemming that's on through this is very quite strong that's on it and very stable. So even in a windy location, it's going to hold up itself very good. Lantanas themselves, very strong stemming. They pair for windy locations, but they'll also take in that endurance where they have sustained heat. Try and stay away from things that get too traily on you, because that's what's going to happen is if they get too trailing, they're going to get wind whipped, and then they're going to look not that great. If you're looking for an alternative to that, if you want foliage plants, there are some ipomaeas now that don't cascade, like Ipomaea marguerite. A lot of people use that. It's a lime chartreuse plant that just trails forever. So there's now new varieties that are more mounding in shape. And the same with petunias. Instead of going for the trailing and cascading type of petunias, maybe go for the ones that have a mounding habit and not a trailing habit.
Does that help, Graham? Is there anything specific type of plant you were thinking about? Oh, well, thanks for calling anyway, Graham. But we actually have another caller, and her name is Janice. Janice, are you ready to talk to our panel of garden experts here on Calling All Gardeners?
You bet.
All right. Well, you're on the air. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. My son's in a rental house, and we took a look at the Google Maps of his place, and it seems like there is all shade in it, but we were hoping to put things like raspberry canes, and which I already got, and strawberries, probably in the front, I'm guessing. But how it's odd. On the ground, these things don't look like trees. They're just like maybe 2 inches wide, the stems. But the Google Maps has it like all totally covered in leaves in the backyard, and we're wondering like what can grow back there.
Yeah, we've been talking a bit about shade and.
Yeah, does it get any sun at all?
It appears to. Like right now, they've got lots of sun in the front because there's no leaves. There weren't any leaves on the tree
before the leaves come out. Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
That's hard, because right now when we take a look at it, even when we are visiting landscaping sites, is how much, and it gets you back to that portion of diffuse shade. And right now it's you know, if you're in an older area that has mature trees, you have to be cognizant of how many leaves that are not out on the trees. That's why a lot of spring blooming plants that are coming up now flower
they take
now.
advantage of the sun while it's there, and then they go down later on in the summer when it shades in.
Because then they sort of go with more foliage. So raspberries, generally in our gardening world, we like to say that 6 hours of sunlight, and especially if that's a very warm time period of it, could be considered full sun. Raspberries themselves, I think, like a lot more sun.
Strawberries are pretty shade tolerant, aren't they?
Strawberries you can go a little bit shade tolerant. Blueberries. Blueberries, if you want some blueberries, and then
definitely. We
you
want
can grow that.
Yeah. Well, they do have a real apple tree in the back, according to the neighbor. And right now it's in full blossom, and there's no snow. I hope there are clouds now, but apparently there wasn't any snow, right? And I'm pretty positive that all these flowers are going to set fruit unless something drastic happens in a week, right?
Mm-hmm. You never know what can happen around here.
We don't know. But I have hopes. And if it can handle, if there's enough sun to have this apple tree, I'm hoping that there's enough sun for the rest of it. It's just odd that the Google Maps shows so much green all around the garden, and you go on the ground and the stems aren't that big and there aren't that many of them. So I'm trying to figure out where all these things came from, or where that picture came from.
Well, you might have to, spend some time this summer just learning your yard, or your son's yard, and see what comes up and what doesn't. And it often takes several years, I think, to really get used to a property and to see where things like where the sunlight is, where it's moist, where it's not, and kind of fit your gardening to the site conditions. Because if you try to plant something that isn't well adapted there, then it won't do very well, and you won't be happy. So spend a bit of time kind of learning about that, and try to plant with the conditions and with the soils.
Thanks so much for the call, Janice. Now, we have an email question from Cameron. Now, Cameron is asking what native prairie species can outcompete quickgrass, if any?
Quackgrass. Oh, I wish there was an easy answer to that, but unfortunately not. Quack is like many of our problem weeds. They're invaders from Europe. They came over with civilization and agriculture. They're adapted to very different environment than we have here in North America and Canada. Quackgrass is probably one of the most invasive and difficult species to control, and you can't, native grasses here didn't evolve with it. Quack was brought over from Europe, and when it got here, there's no other species that's even close. So it just took off, and it's still doing that. So the best thing to do if you've got a lot of quackgrass, the only thing to do, and if you want to get native species going, you have to get rid of the quack. And there's a number of ways of doing it. You can spray it with a glyphosate or Roundup type herbicide when it's about 8-10 inches tall. If you don't want to use herbicides, you can try digging it out, but it has an incredible root system. It can grow, one plant can grow like 100 feet in a year of roots. Wow. So they're really hard to dig out. A good way of getting rid of it if you're patient is to carpet the area with black plastic and let it cook in the sun for a couple of months. That will fry everything in the top 2 or 3 inches. And quack, the one good thing about quack is it doesn't have a deep root system. It has an extensive root system, so covering with black plastic can basically sterilize the soil and get rid of it. But when you do that, if there's quack in the surrounding area or in your neighbor's yard that's adjacent or something, you have to keep a border. You have to keep either deep commercial lawn edging, 6-8 inches a minimum, or have a real deep edge around it, or have a sidewalk or a driveway or a building as an edge to keep the quack from creeping back in, because if you don't, it will do.
Quackgrass is, well, the answer is nothing can outcompete
no,
quackgrass.
I wish there was, but it's the king in terms of invasive species and grasses.
Now, thanks so much for the email. And if you want to sneak a call in today or get one in for next week's show, here's how you can do it.
Do you have a gardening question for one of our experts on the show today? We would love to hear from you. Please phone in to register your question by dialing 204-480-3500. Leave a message and volunteers will call you back as soon as they can. That's when we put your question out live on air. You can also register your question online. Go to shaw.ca/Shaw TV Winnipeg or check our Facebook page.
I'm your host, John Wilson. We have our guests here, Carla and the other John.
Yeah, it's a good name.
Yeah, solid name. And we got just a few more minutes here for your live calls, and we have a caller, Anne, on the line. Anne, can you give us your question here about gardening?
Yes, my name is Ann Kassar, and I would like to know how to make the hydrangea really grow in big blooms. I fertilize it. It is in a good spot, but it just doesn't want to, like you see sometimes the hydrangeas take off and they got big blooms, and it's 3 years and it's not really doing all that well. What am I doing wrong?
Okay. Hydrangeas are, they're very much like evergreens. They like high acidic content, which is if you're looking at your fertilizer ratio, it's your NPK ratio. So your high front number is your nitrogen. So if you could supplement it with some high nitrogen, sometimes even, around my hydrangeas, I use castings from my cedar trees and my evergreens, and I put that into the soil mix so it decomposes. And I'll also fertilize it too with 30-10-10 or 36-12-12 fertilizer. The other thing is, if it's only 3 years old, maybe check and see where it was planted. My question would be, is it planted in an existing bed where it was nice and light soil, or was it planted in an old established bed where maybe the hole wasn't dug big enough and backfilled with some nice loose soil? So there's a couple things that you may want to investigate to see why it's not progressing as big as it should be. And if it's not progressing as big, then it will probably forego on its blooming.
Does that help, Anne?
Yes, but it was put in a new bed. There was nothing there before. It is in the shade, and like I put the sulfate, like that blueberry sulfate around it, and it just doesn't seem to want to bloom that big.
Yeah, the blueberry sulfate, is it a blue hydrangea or is it a pink hydrangea?
It's an endless summer.
It's an endless summer. So the sulfate is going to help to keep it blue. That's on there, but I think you need the nitrogen that's going to help it. And endless summer too as well. If it's in really deep shade, I've experienced that it doesn't get to its full maturity. So sometimes adding a little bit more light to it and then just seeing it that way. But I know that it normally doesn't get as big as what it is if it's in a deeper shade than having a little bit more sunlight.
All right, well, thanks so much for the call, Anne. We're actually out of time here on Calling All Gardeners, episode 3. There's 2 more live episodes where you can call in and speak to gardening experts. And so that would be next Thursday and the Thursday after, 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. Thanks so much, Carla Hersina, John Morgan, for coming on the program. Calling All Gardeners on Shaw TV. See you next time.